Okay, good morning. We're going to go ahead and start and see who joins us as we go along here. We're going to be continuing in our discussion on bones today, and we'll probably finish up this chapter. In fact, I know we'll finish up this chapter by Thursday if we don't finish today. And we'll move on into muscles after that. Now, you may have seen, I guess, I don't know if we've met since then, but I have pushed all the due dates back for all the exams, 3, 4, and 5, and for the lab exams, 3 and 4, back till December the 9th. And that is the last day of the semester. I have no leeway past that. So please don't wait to the last minute to get caught up on all your exams. Take them as we go along when you're ready for them, but they're also a very good review for you for the final, but I won't have any leeway to extend past December the 9th. I mean, that's the end of the semester. So I can't, they won't let me. So anyway, any questions on anything? Okay. In that case, I'm going to go ahead and open this up and get us into bones. And this is where we stopped the last time. We were looking at hormones and what they do to our bones, because we haven't really talked about it a lot, but in AP2 we'll spend a long time talking about hormones. Hormones function as chemical messengers. Hormones are the other big control system in our body, the endocrine system. We have the nervous system as instantaneous control, and the endocrine system, which releases hormones, as the long-term, slower control, on more of a long-term basis. Some of the effects of the endocrine system last for years. And we talked briefly, I guess, last Thursday about growth hormone and even insulin, and then the role of the sex hormones. The sex hormones, the estrogen and the testosterone, are going to stimulate osteoblast activity. Now, we know that growth hormone does this. Growth hormone stimulates protein synthesis, and we have to have energy for that to take place. And we use the insulin to help regulate blood sugar levels. So those are other hormones that come into play here. But here we see the big impact of the sex hormones. Estrogens produced by the female ovary, produced by the cells within the ovary, and the androgens that are coming out from the adrenal glands. The adrenal gland that has an inner and an outer layer. The outer layer of the adrenal gland secretes 3 different types of hormones. Androgens are essentially testosterone released by both males and females. However, in the female, the androgens are converted to estrogen. So it's another source of estrogen. In fact, it's usually thought that the androgens are going to be the trigger to start puberty. And in males, androgens are essentially testosterone, so it's testosterone. Both of these, and you'll hear all about that in AP2 also. These 2 sex hormones will stimulate osteoblast activity at the epiphyseal plate. So you'll see a great deal of bone development on the long bones. And so this gives us our growth spurt when we go through puberty. Now, the growth spurt in females comes earlier than males do, whatever. Females start puberty a year, 2 years earlier than males do. Don't know why, but they do. So you'll start producing estrogen, and if you're if you have a female patient, you're explaining that they start producing estrogen, and that starts to stimulate bone growth, and you get osteoblast activity, the bone builders, and you have enlargement of the long bones, and your pubescent female starts to will ultimately achieve her adult stature. There is so much sex hormone being released that we get a real growth spurt. We see individuals, having significant increases in body stature over a short period of time. The reason that the female reaches her adult stature earlier is because the estrogen stimulates rapid bone growth, but then since estrogen levels continue to rise, they actually inhibit osteoblast activity when they get extremely high. And so that shuts down the growth plate. So the growth plate stops producing, osteoblast activity shuts down sooner in the female than it does in the male. So the osteoblasts stop, the epiphyseal growth plate shuts down earlier in the female. It's sort of a two-edged sword here, because the estrogen stimulates osteoblast activity to occur, and you get rapid growth, but then the continued increase in estrogen in the female is going to cause that plate to shut down, and so growth stops. Long bone growth stops. Now, osteoblast activity will continue throughout the body. It isn't just the long bones that are going to see osteoblast activity. All bones are going to have this. Estrogen stimulates bone buildup. And this works great until estrogen levels drop at menopause. The only sources of estrogen then are from the androgens, and that's not sufficient to keep building up bone faster than it's tearing down, particularly if your patient had, your postmenopausal female had a history of poor exercise and poor dietary habits, and not a lot of calcium in their diet and things like that. And that leads to osteoporosis. We'll get onto that here in a few minutes. So estrogen causes bone growth. It shuts down long bone growth, and it continues to stimulate osteoblast activity throughout the female's reproductive lifetime. Very similar structure to testosterone. They look very similar. They're a steroid. So they have the 4-ring structure there. The rings are a little bit different. The functional groups, these little things that hang on the outside of the rings, are a little bit different in each one. Not much different, but they are different enough to have different effects. So the estrogen plays a major role in why your female patient will go through puberty earlier, reach her adult stature earlier, and then stop growing. Back here, should have mentioned testosterone. Testosterone stimulates bone growth also at the epiphyseal plate in males. It develops it starts occurring about 2 years after after puberty starts in the female. Usually there's about a 1 to 2 year lag between puberty onset in the female and in the male. Testosterone levels develop later, start increasing later. We start seeing the growth spurt in the male several years after the growth spurt in the female. And you'll see the male develop body stature increase to reach their adult stature. Remember, all this body stature is usually always directed by our genetics. Our genes determine for a lot of us, well, I guess for all of us, determine, our body stature. What are we going to look like? How tall are we going to be? How short are we going to be? Are we, what are our bones? What is our bone structure going to look like? All that's pretty much predetermined for us. A lot of it also has to do with diet and exercise. What kind of diet do we maintain going through childhood and puberty? How much exercise do we have? That's also going to determine our bones are going to do. Now, testosterone will continue long bone development until the epiphyseal plates also close. Testosterone levels will stimulate that enough to start shutting it down. And then those, we drop from the dramatic growth when we get the growth spurts to just, sort of a slow, steady decline, which then eventually shuts down by about age 23. Now, I go backwards. Yes. Now, other hormones involved here. I mentioned insulin. Insulin does also, besides helping to regulate blood sugar levels in our bodies, it also stimulates bone development. Believe it or not, insulin has more than one role. We always think about it as controlling blood sugar, but it also will stimulate osteoblast activity. All these hormones are working together. No one hormone works in a vacuum. They're all interrelated here. They all have secondary functions. The glucocorticoids, the hormone that you see in a glucocorticoid is a hormone also from the adrenal cortex. It's what you find in an inhaler, a rescue inhaler. The steroid in a rescue inhaler is usually a glucocorticoid. They will inhibit osteoclast activity. They inhibit bone breakdown. If we're not talking inhalers, we're just talking cortisol released from the adrenal cortex will allow bones to develop because it inhibits the osteoclast, the bone breakdown. So we stay ahead, thanks to insulin stimulating osteoblast and glucocorticoids inhibiting osteoclast, we continue to see good bone development in here. Now, the two hormones that are directly involved in regulating the calcium levels, and because you can't build bones without calcium. You have to have calcium. You have to have calcium and phosphorus. These are the salts that form the hard matrix. This is what makes bone hard, is calcium and phosphorus. That is the non-living portion of the bone. 65% of our bone is calcium and phosphorus salts. Now, the hormones that regulate this are parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. What they monitor is not the amount of bone, not the amount of calcium in the blood. Let me back up. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin monitor the level of calcium in the blood. They don't worry about how much calcium's in the bone. They just maintain, because it would be almost impossible to measure the amount of calcium in the bone. So we measure the amount of calcium in the blood. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin can respond through negative feedback based on calcium levels in the blood. And if calcium levels in the blood are too low, then we will stimulate breakdown of bone. And if they're too high, we'll stimulate buildup of bone. So we're not concerned, these two hormones are not concerned about how much calcium's in the bone, but rather they're concerned about the calcium levels in our blood. And our bones are the big reservoir, the big source of calcium. 99% or more of all the calcium in our bodies is found, is found in our bone. And if we get too much in our blood, we build the bone back up. And if there's too little in our blood, we tear the bone down because we have other needs for calcium. And the calcium, I probably said this the other day, but the calcium is responsible for muscle contractions, for nerve impulses, for blood clotting, for cell division. Calcium has a lot of uses here. And so we have to have a certain amount of calcium available to the cells for other activities. So we use calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. And they come into play a lot because we're always seeing an increase or a decrease in blood calcium levels. Now, I'll be completely open here. It's nearly always a decrease in blood calcium. There are very few times when we would have a rise in blood calcium. See, because we're always doing something to our bones. We're always recycling our bones. We're always remodeling our bones. We tear down bone and build up new bone every day. About 5% of our bone is recycled on a weekly basis. In fact, all of our spongy bone has been dissolved and rebuilt every 3 to 4 years. So the spongy bone we have now at the head of our femur, for example, is not the same spongy bone that was there 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. We have rebuilt it. We have taken it out and rebuilt it again to make it strong, to keep it strong, and in spite of the wear and tear it gets. Compact bone we replace every 10 years. The common statement is, well, we get a new skeleton every 10 years. And then, of course, it isn't like we suddenly wake up one morning, oh, I feel good, I got my new skeleton today. But we've completely replaced all the compact bone in our bodies on a 10-year cycle. We're tearing down and building up all the time. Now, this remodeling is what we call it. Bone deposition, bone resorption. We dissolve the bone and we build up bone. In fact, the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts usually work side by side, because the osteoblasts are the bone builders. They lay down the matrix, they form the lacunae and the canals, and the osteocytes get trapped in the lacunae. The osteoblasts get trapped in the lacunae and become osteocytes. The osteoclasts are large, they have all the lysosomes for dissolving bone, and they are going to work side by side, dissolving and rebuilding, dissolving and rebuilding. The osteoclasts dissolve the bone, release the calcium, and the osteoblasts use that calcium to lay down new matrix. Now, the two mechanisms that apply here, how do we know when to remodel? How do we get our directions to remodel? Well, there's two ways. One of them is through the use of our hormones. And the hormones are driven by the levels of calcium in the blood. The hormone levels use negative feedback. And so this is the instruction to tell we better release some hormones because our calcium levels are too high, or we better release some hormones because our calcium levels are too low. These are the directions. This is the hormonal direction to remodel our bone. The other approach is based on stress, mechanical, not like emotional stress, but mechanical stress. An increase or a decrease in the load or force that's applied to our bones. Are we working in a very strenuous occupation as a server, perhaps, or maybe construction? Both of those are very demanding jobs that require a lot of energy and a great deal of work, great deal of physical labor. That's the kind of mechanical stress. Now, the hormonal controls are based on blood calcium levels. And as I said, we need calcium besides in our for our strong bones. We need calcium for generating nerve impulses, sending signals through our nerves. We need lots of calcium for skeletal muscle to contract. Without calcium, we can't contract our skeletal muscle. Our heart depends on calcium for in a different way for our heart to contract. So it's sort of important in the heart too. In the whole scheme of the step-by-step schematic that shows how blood coagulates, there are several places where calcium is absolutely essential to forming clots when we're bleeding. We don't like to bleed out. Calcium controls the release of other substances from various glands, the sebaceous glands and the sweat glands, and like the milk glands, and things like that, the lubricating glands. That's all very important. But calcium's involved there, as well as in cell division. Now we know that we have the vast majority of our calcium is in our bones. 99% of our calcium is in our bones. But did you know that to absorb calcium, you drink a glass of milk and it has vitamin D in it, okay? And everybody says, well, when you're a kid, drink your milk, it makes your bones strong. They never explain how it makes your bones strong. The vitamin D that's found in milk or in dairy products, which is added, by the way. Vitamin D doesn't occur naturally in fresh, whole cow's milk. The vitamin D is needed to absorb calcium in the gut. So now whole milk will have lots of calcium in it, which is occurring naturally. You can't get that calcium unless you have vitamin D. Vitamin D enables the calcium to cross the membrane of the small intestine. So, and vitamin D is considered a hormone, where it's in its active form, it's turned into a hormone. So one of the things that we hear all the time is, vitamin D absolutely essential for strong bones, and that's true as long as there's calcium present. Because vitamin D will allow us to absorb calcium. No vitamin D, no calcium absorption. No calcium in the diet, no calcium absorption either. So you can have all the vitamin D you want, but if there isn't calcium available, it's not going to absorb. So, okay. Hormonal controls. The two hormones that we hear the most about are calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. Now, calcitonin is produced by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is a little butterfly-shaped gland that sits in the middle of your throat. It's about 2 or 3 inches high and about 2 inches across, shaped like a letter H or a butterfly. And its primary role is to produce thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone controls our metabolic activity in the cells. How fast do we burn glucose? That's its primary role. The thyroid gland also contains clusters of cells called parafollicular cells, and they produce calcitonin. And calcitonin stimulates osteoblasts to lay down bone, to put excess, and what that does is just a minute, okay. Sorry, my dogs are going crazy. I need of the House. I need to pause this. I got to answer a question from the Dean's office in Morristown. Hang on 1 second. I'm going to go over out of this briefly. Okay, I think I solved that problem from Moorestown. Sorry about that. Let me get back to this now. Okay, so we were talking about remodeling controls, the hormonal controls. Calcitonin made by the thyroid gland. When blood calcium levels get too high, it kicks in. It stimulates osteoblast activity. And when it does that, we get lots of bone growth. Now, the only problem here is that we very rarely have high levels of blood calcium. We don't usually get this. This is, blood calcium levels usually don't get very high. So we very rarely use calcitonin because our blood calcium is always in a negative state. It's always below normal. So calcitonin is not an important player in regulating bone, bone deposition, bone remodeling, bone breakdown. We very rarely are going to be in a state of high calcium. Now it's possible. It's possible. It's not impossible for this to occur, but it doesn't happen very often, if at all. Usually we are in a state of lower than desirable calcium levels. And the major player that comes in here is parathyroid hormone. It's made by the parathyroid gland. So you might get an idea where it's located because we hear the term parathyroid. Well, parathyroid glands are 4 little glands, each about the size and shape of a raisin, embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid. And they secrete parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast activity. It says, okay, release release the inhibitions on the osteoclast, let the osteoclast go to work and dissolve bone and put that calcium back in the blood. So our calcium levels go back up through negative feedback. What the stimulus is, low calcium levels, and we reverse the stimulus, classic negative feedback. And we stop releasing parathyroid hormone when our blood calcium levels come back up to normal, but then they drop again, so we release it. Parathyroid hormone is the most important hormone in regulating blood calcium. Calcitonin is its antagonist, and like we have antagonistic muscles, the biceps and the triceps are antagonistic, the hamstrings and the quads are antagonistic. They work against each other. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone work against each other. When calcitonin works, if it ever does, it's the antagonist to parathyroid hormone, because parathyroid hormone is always going to be tearing down bone, and calcitonin is always going to be building it up if and when it's working. Now, this is your classic negative feedback loop for calcitonin. If the blood calcium levels on the left go up, then we're going to release calcitonin from the thyroid gland. That's going to inhibit the osteoclasts. So we're not going to be tearing down bone. We're going to instead stimulate the osteoblast to build more bone. So, and it does happen, but it just doesn't happen with great frequency or in very large amounts. Parathyroid hormone does all the heavy lifting here. Here's where the parathyroid glands are located. They're on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. And so they're not in the front, they're in the back. They're each one's about the size and shape of a raisin. The illustrations here are really, the glands are poorly drawn. They're each about half that size. And the release of parathyroid hormone will bring our blood calcium levels back up again. It's negative feedback. we detect low calcium or lower calcium levels. We stimulate um, the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland, and that we have three approaches that we use to bring our calcium levels back up. So the first thing we do is if they shut down, parathyroid hormone shuts down osteoblasts. We shut down the osteoblasts, the bone builders. We don't need to be building up any more bone if we're trying to get calcium out. So we shut down osteoblasts and we stimulate osteoclast activity. The bone dissolvers. That's the first thing we do. The second thing we do is that we enhance the absorption of calcium in the small intestine. And this is where vitamin D comes into play. Vitamin D gets made in our skin by exposure to ultraviolet radiation and sunlight. We make vitamin D. It has to get activated by the kidneys and the liver and turned into its active form, a hormone called calcitriol, and that allows the absorption of calcium in the small intestine. If we didn't have vitamin D, we can't absorb calcium. So we have to have active vitamin D to do this. And so we increase the absorption of calcium in the small intestine. So that's the second way we bring our calcium levels up. So any calcium in the diet that we're picking up is going to be absorbed. We're going to activate our vitamin D in large quantities, and we're going to start absorbing greater amounts of calcium. And the third thing that parathyroid hormone does is tell our kidneys to retain calcium and don't pee it away. So we pull calcium back out of our urine and we retain it. So these are it's a very sophisticated approach here to do three activities. It isn't just, let's make some more bone like calcitonin does. What we have here is we stop building up bone and we start breaking it down. We enhance absorption of calcium in the small intestine, and we stop peeing away calcium in the kidneys. And so we have a fairly sophisticated flow chart here. I'm not big on long, complicated flow charts like this, but this is a pretty good one because this, you have three distinct pathways here, and they're all very clear. So your blood calcium levels drop. That stimulates the release of parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands. It will stop osteoblasts from being built. It will increase the activity of the osteoclasts, and that will dissolve more bone. So we're going to stop building up bone. We're going to start breaking down more bone. The end result is we get more calcium being released into the blood. That's the first approach. The second approach, parathyroid hormone causes us to make more calcitriol. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. We get the liver and the kidneys to activate the vitamin D. And so now we are absorbing more calcium across the small intestine, because that's where everything gets absorbed, is in the small intestine. But it also raises our blood calcium, because when it gets absorbed, where does it go? It goes straight into the blood. And it tells us to stop releasing calcium through our urine in the kidneys. So we retain that calcium. It stays in the plasma, meaning it stays in the blood, and our blood calcium levels, with the effect of all three, go up. Calcium is a very significant mineral, and so it's important that we regulate it. We need calcium for so many things. Yes, we have to have strong bones, but we also need it for our nerve impulses and our muscle contractions. If we get too high or too low, hypocalcemia is the term we use for calcium levels being low, and hypercalcemia is elevated calcium. If our calcium levels are too low, then we are hyperexcitable. If our calcium levels are too low, we become hyperexcitable. We generate nerve impulses rapidly, and become very agitated. It generally comes to a bad end. Hypercalcemia, there's so much calcium present in the muscles that our muscles can't contract. There's so much calcium present in our nerves are non-responsive. That's also a bad situation. On a minor scale, excessive calcium in the blood can cause deposition of calcium in the kidneys, because you have so much calcium in the kidneys. If you're hypercalcemic, you're not getting rid of it. You have so much calcium present in the kidneys that it's not being excreted, and it forms kidney stones. Kidney stones are called renal calculi, and they become very large and they have very sharp edges, and they're very painful to pass, and they can cause excruciating pain to your patient that has a kidney stone caused by high levels of calcium. So very uncomfortable situation, very painful situation here, trying to break that stone down or trying to get the stone to pass. That is the least of the problems when a person has too much calcium in their blood. So, other hormones have a little bit of an impact here too. Leptin is a hormone released by the adipose tissue. Remember, adipose tissues only get bigger or smaller based on the amount of fat they're holding. The leptin actually inhibits osteoblasts. And so when we release leptin from our adipose tissue, our bones get weaker. We inhibit osteoblasts, our bone density decreases, our bones get weaker. That's not a good thing either. So serotonin also affects osteoblast activity. Now, serotonin is a mood stabilizer. In fact, the whole basis of depression has nothing to do with character or weakness of spirit or anything that people say, that why someone becomes depressed. It's all about the chemistry, and it's caused by a lack of serotonin in the brain. Serotonin is what we call a neurotransmitter. It stabilizes mood. It keeps us at, hopefully at an even balance between, highs and lows. Too much serotonin makes us feel overly happy. Too little serotonin causes us to become depressed and stay depressed. So apparently serotonin levels can interfere with osteoblast activity too. So depending on what the serotonin's doing, it's going to affect our bone buildup. So a lot of hormonal activity here going on. Now mechanically, we have mechanical stress coming into play here. Whenever we do something with our muscles, bones are stressed. Bones are stressed through walking and talking and running and climbing and riding a bicycle and sitting. Driving our car stresses our bones. Turning the wheel, sitting in the seat. Various occupations stress bones. If you're working, a physically demanding job, construction or working as a server. If you don't think that serving is physically demanding, try it sometime. But so is in any occupation that involves a great deal of physical activity and physical labor. All this activity causes stress on our bones. When we pull on the bones with our muscles, because our muscles are pulling on our bones to use our bones as levers. When the muscles pull on the bones, it creates stress on the bones. Or when we have weight applied to our bones. one of the reasons that our leg bones are so thick and strong is because they support the weight of the body. Gravity is pulling our body weight down on top of our bones, and our bones respond by becoming larger. Our leg bones, our thighs, the tibia and the femur are very powerful. The pelvic girdle is a much larger structure than the pectoral girdle. So we see that structure designed to respond to the forces of gravity pulling the upper half of the body down in the lower half. That's a force being applied to the bone. Doesn't have anything to do with the muscles, but it's gravity working against us. Mechanical stress causes us to modify the shape of our bones. We can make our bones weaker, stronger. If we have more stress applied to the bone, they will become lighter and weaker if there's less stress applied here. And this is called Wolff's Law. Now, this is one of the few laws that this is the only law you have to learn in AP1. There's only 3 or 4 that you learn in AP2, and they're all involved with, most of those are involved with respiration. Anyway, Wolff's Law says that bones grow or remodel, and this is important because remodeling doesn't always mean growth. Bones grow or remodel in response to the demands placed on them. So if you put a great deal apply a great deal of forces or stresses on your bone's going to get bigger. It's going to respond to that. You work construction, you work as a server, you lift weights, you exercise frequently. Those are all going to cause bones to grow because those are forces being applied to the bone. On the other hand, if you have a patient that is elderly and doesn't exercise much or is in a very sedentary occupation where all they do is sit a lot, or they have very little physical activity at whatever age they're in, their bones are going to get weaker. Their bones are going to remodel based on the lack of stress. The bones will get thinner. Now, and we'll lose bone cells. Now, muscles will also get weaker. Muscles get bigger and stronger by when more forces are required from them. When the muscles are forced to contract more frequently and stronger, muscles will get enlarged. They won't lay down new cells, but the cells that are there will get bigger. They'll add more protein fibers. They can do that. And they'll pull on bones. And that'll make the bones respond by getting bigger and more powerful. If the muscles weaken, they're going to be losing protein. If your patient is not active, doesn't engage in any kind of strenuous activity or work or exercise, then their muscles are going to respond by losing protein, losing muscle mass, getting smaller and weaker, haven't lost any cells, just smaller and weaker. And the bones will respond too by remodeling into a lighter, smaller structure. So Wolff's Law says that bones grow or remodel in response to the demands placed on them, regardless, whatever the demand is. Demand can go both ways here. So this is Wolff's Law. And, bones are going to respond, they're going to get stressed. And when we stress a bone, one side compresses, the other side stretches because your pressure is usually on one side of the bone. And so bones become very strong in response to that stress. We also see this showing up when we're dealing with dominant side. Whether we have a dominant right side or a dominant left hand or a dominant right hand, the dominant side is going to have a thicker bone because we use that bone and those muscles more frequently than the other side. If you're left dominant, your left arm is going to be stronger. If you're right dominant, your right arm is going to be stronger. So our bone size will increase based on the demand we're applying to it. If the more demands you place, the stronger the attachments for the muscles are going to get. Because muscles don't attach directly to bone. Muscles are connected to tendons, and tendons attach to the bone. The points of attachment of the tendons become very powerful because there's a lot of force being pulled on that bone by the tendon. So the greater the force we apply on the bones, the bigger the attachments are going to be. Now, problem. How do we know where to increase the bone? How do we know how to just, okay, we're going to stimulate osteoblast activity. We're going to release growth hormone. We're going to release insulin. We're going to build up our bones. How do we know where? Because hormones circulate throughout the body, and anywhere there's a receptor site, they're going to be active. And receptor sites are present on all bones, for example. So how do we know where to grow? Well, it turns out that the mechanical stresses on the bone will generate nerve impulses that tell us where to increase the bone. Mechanical stress tells us where the bone has to change. Mechanical stress, or the lack of it, will tell us what remodeling has to occur. Now, the hormones, growth hormone, for example, or calcitonin or parathyroid hormone, will alter those bones in response to the signal from the stress. The stresses generate electrical signals, nerve impulses, that will tell us this is where we remodel. Do we build up or do we tear down? So the mechanical stress itself tells us where we're going to make the change. The hormones tell us how to do it, what we have to do to make it work. But the mechanical stress tells us where. We don't, if we're building up the bones of our upper arm, the humerus, for example, we certainly don't want to see an increase in the size of our foot. I mean, it's not what we're working on. If we're lifting weights, if we're strengthening our pectoral muscles by lifting weights and working out, we hope to see the bones in the upper arm and the humerus and around the shoulder increase in size. We're not really concerned about the size of the phalanges in our foot at that point. So, okay, now, bone remodeling occurs throughout our lifetime. Now, we generally stop laying down long bone. We don't have longitudinal growth, meaning that's a more formal way of saying the bones don't get any longer once the epiphyseal plates close. Once those plates close, that's the length of the bone. That's what we're going to get. About 23 years of age, whatever it is there, that's how tall we're going to be. That's our body stature. And with a skeleton, you can still calculate the entire size of an individual just off the femur. There are formulas that you measure the length of the femur and plug it into the equation, and it will tell you with fairly good accuracy the approximate height of an individual. So you're a weightlifter. You're over 23 years of age and you're a weightlifter and you want to be an Olympic weightlifter. And so you work out constantly and you're lifting weights, and you're holding thousands of pounds over your head or whatever a weightlifter will lift. The size of the insertion points where the bones, where the muscles attached to the bones are going to be very, very large. Then you stop. You stop lifting massive weights. Gradually over time, those points of insertion are going to shrink because the demands from your muscles are going to shrink too. So the whole body, the bones will lighten up depending on exercise or non-exercise you're doing. Now, suppose you are an astronaut. Suppose instead of a weightlifter, you decide you want to be an astronaut. And so you're in the space station. You go to the space station for a year. You know, lots of astronauts do it now. Lots of men and women have been in space for a year or longer to prove that we can have long duration space flight. That's why they do it. And what will happen to their bones is that their bones will lighten up. Their muscle mass will shrink and their bones will lighten because there's no gravity essentially in the space station. The force of gravity is negated by the force of the station spinning around the Earth. So that we're essentially in you're essentially in a zero gravity environment. And without gravity pulling on our bodies, our muscles, you know, a lot of the forces applied to our muscles and bones is eliminated. And so our bones will get weaker and our muscle mass will shrink. Now they exercise, astronauts will exercise. There is a lot of exercise equipment on the space station. It's all resistance equipment like Bowflexes and Nordic tracks and stuff like that. But can't exercise 24 hours a day to make up for the lack of gravity. You know, astronauts that have been in space for over a year, when they return to Earth, frequently have to be essentially carried out of the spacecraft when it lands because on the risk that their bones are not strong enough to support their body weight with gravity being applied again. So the bone remodeling, while there is no longitudinal remodeling here, you know, the bones are not going to get bigger, but we have something called appositional growth where we grow from side to side. We're not going to see that either. When we want to make a bone stronger, it grows from side to side. We're going to see the bones shrink from side to side. We're going to see the bones get weaker and weaker because, you know, there's the forces that are normally on them have been cut way back. So with this, the term here is appositional growth, side to side growth. That disappears when we're in space. And of course, one of the things we're always aware of is damage to bone. We've all had, you know, many of us have had fractures. Many of us have broken bones. It happens when we're young. You know, we usually break our bones through some sort of trauma. You know, we play contact sports, or we play sports that are not usually contact, but they become contact. We sometimes we do dumb things and we fall and injure ourselves, and it happens. Well, you know, and we break bones. It takes a lot of force to break a bone, particularly when we're younger, because our bones when we're younger are very strong. And many times the fracture doesn't even go all the way through the bone. We still break it, but it isn't a complete fracture. We can apply, you know, bones are incredibly strong, but you can apply enough force to a bone to cause it to break. It does occur. When we're older, when you know, in the case of the elderly, bones fracture easily because they have gotten thinner. Yeah, there's less bone buildup. There's less osteoblast activity, and so it's easier for a bone to break. An elderly person can, a normal, running into something, running into tripping over a table or walking into a table and hitting their tibia with it can cause their bone to crack. because it's so thin. Sometimes, you know, if they get out of bed and they stand up and they lose their balance and they fall down, they can break an arm. Or, you know, a common injury for older people is to trip and fall and to break the bones of the wrist. Because when you fall down, what do? You put your hands out to break your fall. And usually what happens is when you do that and you're elderly and your bones are weak enough, you'll break the bones of your wrist, or you may even break the ends of the ulna and the radius. Bones, though, are also unique in that not only can they be strong, they can always break, they can always fracture, but they'll also always repair themselves. Bones are going to repair a fracture whether we do anything to them or not. Bones will grow back together again, whether we reduce the fracture. Reduce means to align the bone. Whether we align the bone or not, the bone will repair itself and heal. And if it doesn't line up properly when it's healing, that doesn't matter. That's how it's going to grow together. The bone may be in an awkward position, awkward shape when it heals up, but bones will heal on their own, whether we do anything or not. Types of fractures that we encounter. We can have a displaced fracture where the bone ends are out of alignment. You know, they're skewed away from each other and they have to be realigned. That's called reduction of the fracture. We reduce the fracture by lining them up, or they can be non-displaced. It can be a nice clean break, and they're all, all you have to do is immobilize the arm, and it'll heal. So it can either be displaced or non-displaced. It can be complete or incomplete. Is it broken all the way through, or is it only broken on one side? That happens a lot in children. Children have what's known as a green stick fracture, because, you know, like we refer to it in reference to, like when you try to break a branch off of a tree, you're pruning the tree and you try to break it off and it doesn't break completely because the wood's green. Okay, so, and it's strong enough and flexible enough, it'll have a lot of give. Well, children's bones are like that. They're very flexible. And when they break, they usually break on one side and not all the way through. So that's an incomplete fracture, as opposed to a complete fracture straight through the bone. Is the skin penetrated? That's the third category. Is it open? That's a compound fracture, where a bone is penetrating the skin, causing blood loss and a lot of pain and tissue damage. And you're also exposing the bone and the underlying tissue to bacteria. The bacteria that was on the surface of your skin, the bacteria that was present where you injured yourself. All that's now potential problems in here. Or is it closed? Is it a simple fracture? You know, yes, the bone's broken. It may be displaced. It may be non-displaced. It may be complete or incomplete, but it didn't tear through the skin. So you have less concerns about the penetration of bacteria through here. Some types of fractures. Here is an open fracture, a compound fracture, a displaced. We have the humerus penetrating through the skin. Here we see a green stick fracture right here, where we break on one side, not the other, not all the way through. Comminuted, where we shatter the bone. We see that a lot in the elderly because their bones are more brittle. Linear fractures, running up and down the length of the bone. We see this a lot when we break our fingers. Usually a lot of breaks in our fingers are linear. The distal end of your phalange breaks. And there's not a lot you can do other than tape your fingers together or put a little finger splint on, because it's not out of alignment. It hasn't penetrated the skin. Other than the pain that you experience, there's nothing else you can do. It'll heal itself on its own. A transverse fracture straight across. Pretty unusual for that to occur, but it can happen. More than likely, some sort of significant blunt force trauma hit the bone and it cracked right along that line. An oblique or a spiral fracture, those two together, occur when you twist the bone during the fracture. You know, a lot of contact sports give you spiral fractures, particularly in the leg. Friday night football, muddy field, Saturday afternoon football, muddy field. Place your foot, make your cut, turn and move, except your foot stuck in the mud, and you turn and your leg didn't, and you receive some blunt force trauma from the opposing team, and your bone twists and snaps. It's may also be an indicator of elder abuse or child abuse. You have to be very careful when you pursue this. You can make sure you're correct by having the bone twisted to, when the elderly patient or the child when the limb is grabbed and twisted, to inflict pain. Possibility. Got to be careful on that. Even though, and that's all I want to say on I don't want to go any further in that, but that's something just to keep in the back of your mind. Lots of spiral fractures occur naturally. Well, not naturally, but normally. Normal, accidents do happen. Sometimes spiral fractures occur from elder abuse or child abuse. Now, is this the worst fracture you've ever seen? This is a gymnast at the summer games, the previous summer games, not the ones that were just ended this year, I guess. A gymnast getting ready to do her floor routine. She comes up and hits the mat, and her legs bend the wrong way. She hits the mat wrong. Now, who would think that this could happen? But it did. And notice that her knees, both knees, bent backwards. Our legs are not designed to bend backwards, but you can see the fracture, the top of the tibia in both legs shattered. And you can see how the tibia on both legs is displaced below the level of the knee, because the tibia lines up straight with the femur. It isn't depressed like it is there. Our legs don't bend that way. In ESPN's Hall of Fame, I guess this is their worst fracture. This is Monday Night Football, probably 30 years ago. The quarterback, in the process here, is having his leg bent in 3 different directions, shattering his femur. It's very hard to shatter the femur because it's the largest and strongest bone in the body. The crack was audible on TV, in the stadium. And you notice that I drew in the line here. You can see his leg is being bent in 3 different directions, not what you'd expect to see. And that was a career-ending injury. Nobody's leg can bend like that and not be fractured. So, and this is what we see, the typical fracture at the knee. At the hip. This is the classic hip fracture. Even though it is the neck of the femur that breaks, this is what happens when you lose all the compact bone. Lose all the spongy bone underneath the compact bone of the head and neck of the femur, because the head and neck of the femur has a hard layer of compact bone on the outside and is mostly spongy bone underneath because of all the stresses that the head and neck of the femur deal with in movement. And they do it, and the spongy bone does a very good job in displacing all that stress, mechanical stress, in all different directions, so we don't even notice it. But with osteoporosis in play, the spongy bone is dissolved. That's where it attacks. And we lose a lot of the spongy bone underneath here, and all we have left is the outer shell. And given the right amount of, given the right circumstances, a minor stress, a sneeze, a cough, a trip over a rug, rolling over in bed funny, stepping off a sidewalk, any of these can cause that weak femur to snap right there. And this is usually where it occurs, right here at the neck of the femur. That's when someone breaks their hip. When an elderly person breaks their hip, it is nearly always right there at the neck of the femur. Don't want to say 100% because anything is possible. So as soon as I say it always happens there, we'll hear about somebody fractured their acetabulum or fractured the ilium at the iliac crest or something like that, because those can happen too. Anything can happen, but nearly always it's going to be a fracture right there at the neck of the femur. When you treat a fracture, you have to reduce it. You have to, if necessary, you have to reduce it. You have to realign the bone ends. The ends of the bones have been shattered, and so you put them back together again. Line them up at the fracture site, and they'll grow back together because they're living cells are in there. If you don't have to do anything, then that's great. But realignment simply may often be applied, just applying traction to the leg or to the arm to pull the bones back together in place. And that's all it does. You have a closed reduction where you can manipulate the bone and feel it grate against each end and line it up, and it's reduced. Open reduction requires surgery to go in, particularly if you have the bone shattered into a couple pieces. To reduce it, you got to go in and use metal plates and screws and pins and wire to wire it back together again. Bone will grow over all that structure, and you'll have a very strong bone here. It will grow around and over the plates, and it works. The bone is rebuilt. You need time to give that. You got to give that bone time to heal. So immobilizing the bone is usually the approach. You end up with a cast. Casts have come a long way. 50 years ago, a cast was made out of plaster and weighed about 10 or 15 pounds or more on your arm or your leg. Now they're made out of, they're some sort of synthetic composite. They're, fiberglass. They're very, very lightweight. They still do the job, but they're not as uncomfortable or as heavy as an old plaster cast would be. Traction would get applied simply to keep the bone lined up too, if necessary. So generally a fracture will heal in 6 to 8 weeks, depending on patient's age and severity and stuff like that. But the average is about 6 to 8 weeks. This is an open reduction. This is a tibia, and you see in the tibia here that there are 3 screws and 4 pins. The pins extend through the leg, through the soft tissue and to the surface, and the screws and pins are embedded in the bone. Now the pins will come out. The screws and the plates that are in place there will stay there, and the bone will grow around that, because you can see that the tibia was pretty well shattered. You can see the site of the fracture right there. This is the open reduction through surgery, and this is what that looks like from the outside. Pin, pin, and pin in here, and then the screws and plates are inside. The same for the ulna and the radius. This is a displaced fracture. It looks like it was a closed fracture, but notice how the radius is, how the ulna is twisted around here, and there's the radius there. It's broken. Didn't penetrate the skin, but surgically had to go in to reduce this. Lots of metal plates here and here, and lots of screws. There may have been pins through here early on in the process. You can see those plates are going to stay there, and the bone will grow around that. So the bone will heal. Okay, let's get out of here. I apologize for the interruption. I certainly wasn't expecting that. But, you know, when the dean calls, you have to pay attention to him. So anyway, we made a lot of progress. We're going to wrap all this up on Thursday and maybe have time, if I don't get any more calls, have time to get into muscles. And lab this afternoon, we're going to do another review of muscles of the human body. So, and hopefully no interruptions. Thanks a lot, and thank you for your patience.